Hi everyone, this is Sarfraz from Aristotle Prep, and we are looking at passage number 6 from the OG13 RC chapter. This passage contains questions 18 to 25. So we will first read the passage, try to understand it in great detail, and then proceed to the questions. Do keep in mind, as I also said in my introductory RC lecture, this passage has 8 questions, which is too many. And to answer 8 questions, you really need to understand the passage in great detail. An actual passage on the GMAT will never ask you more than 4 questions. 3 to 4 questions is what you get from each passage on the GMAT. So do keep that in mind when you attempt this particular passage and more passages which have a lot of questions. So we will focus on the first sentence of the passage because that's always very, very important. It says, in terrestrial environments, gravity places special demands on the cardiovascular systems of animals. I immediately know the passage will be about or will have something to do with gravity and the cardiovascular system of animals and what demands is gravity placing on these systems, something on those lines. Gravitational pressure can cause blood to pool in the lower regions of the body, making it difficult to circulate blood to critical organs such as the brain. Looks very logical, makes sense. Terrestrial snakes in particular exhibit adaptations that aid in circulating blood against the force of gravity. So the first paragraph basically tells me that gravity creates certain problems on the cardiovascular system of animals, such as when the blood, because of gravity, pools at the bottom of the body, whereas it should actually be distributed all through the body. And to counter that, there are certain adaptations, which it mentioned in the last sentence. That's all I've gathered. Next paragraph says, the problem confronting terrestrial snakes is best illustrated by what happens to sea snakes when removed from their supportive medium. So, okay, it ended the previous paragraph by talking about terrestrial snakes specifically, and now it continues in that vein. So, it's comparing terrestrial snakes now with sea snakes to highlight the problem that terrestrial snakes typically face. Okay, because the vertical pressure gradients within the blood vessels are counteracted by similar pressure gradients in the surrounding water, these of course for sea snakes, the distribution of blood throughout the body of sea snakes remains about the same regardless of their orientation in space, provided they remain in the ocean. So there is no problem that sea snakes face when they are in the ocean. When removed from the water and tilted at various angles with the head up, however, blood pressure at their midpoint drops significantly and at brain level falls to 0. That's a problem. And this is happening with sea snakes. That many terrestrial snakes in similar spatial orientations, which means many terrestrial snakes in similar environments, which is on land, do not experience this kind of circulatory failure, suggests that certain adaptations enable them to regulate blood pressure more effectively in those orientations. So again, after you've read a paragraph, please try to make a prediction as to what happened in this paragraph. In this particular paragraph, the author compares land snakes with sea snakes to show that when sea snakes are brought on land, they face a big problem of blood not reaching the brain. But land snakes or terrestrial snakes don't face this problem. And the reason for that is the last sentence, which talks about some adaptations that terrestrial snakes have. That's all I've gathered. The last paragraph says, one such adaptation. So you see the connection. The second paragraph ends by mentioning some adaptations in land snakes. The last one starts by talking about one of those adaptations, which is the closer proximity of the terrestrial snake's heart to its head. Okay, so a terrestrial snake's heart is closer to the head, obviously to make it easier to pump blood to the head, which helps to ensure circulation to the brain, regardless of the snake's orientation in space. Okay, so you see, when I was reading this particular sentence, I read one such adaptation is the closer proximity of the terrestrial snake's heart to its head. I read that much and I stopped and I thought, and that is when I had said, which means it will make it easier for the blood to reach from the heart to the head, which is what comes later in that sentence. But I spent some time thinking beforehand itself. And it's that kind of thinking that you have to start doing when you read RC passages, because that's the only way to get involved with the passage. Otherwise, you will not be able to avoid what I call superficial reading of the passage. So think a little. I mean, if you think thinking takes time, it doesn't. It makes life a lot easier for you. It saves you a lot of time when you read or when you attempt questions later. So, okay, going back, one such adaptation is the proximity of heart to head. The heart of sea snakes can be located near the middle of the body. Sea snakes. Please don't confuse the snakes. For sea snakes, the heart can be in the middle because they have no problems of blood pressure. A position that minimizes the work entailed in circulating blood to both extremities. In arboreal snakes, if you don't know what arboreal means, it shouldn't make any difference ideally, because you should be able to infer that it's something to do with land snakes, because those are the only two being spoken about. Arboreal, and it said actually, in arboreal snakes, however, which dwell in trees. So arboreal actually means tree dwelling or living in trees. So in arboreal snakes, which dwell in trees and often assume a vertical posture, the average distance from the heart to the head can be as little as 15% of overall body length. So you see, in sea snakes, heart is in the middle of the body. In these arboreal snakes or land snakes, heart is much closer to the head. Such a location requires that blood circulated to the tail of the snake travel a greater distance back to the heart. Okay, a problem solved by another adaptation. So you see, the location of the heart close to the head again leads to a problem. Now the blood that is going to the tail has to come back to the heart, and to come back to the heart, it has to travel a great distance. So now this problem is countered by another adaptation, which is when climbing, arboreal snakes often pause momentarily to wiggle their bodies, causing waves of muscle contraction that advance from the lower torso to the head. By compressing the veins and forcing blood forward, these contractions apparently improve the flow of venous blood returning to the heart. So that's the other adaptation. So the last paragraph talks about two adaptations in land snakes. One is the proximity of the heart to the head. The other is the wriggling of the bodies. So if I have to summarize the entire passage, it starts by talking about gravity and how it places specific demands on animals on land. Then it goes specifically to talk about terrestrial snakes. In the second paragraph, it compares terrestrial snakes with sea snakes and concludes that terrestrial snakes definitely have certain adaptations to prevent the problems caused by gravity. In the last paragraph, it talks about two of those adaptations. It's absolutely a neutral passage. The author does not have any agenda. It's an absolutely descriptive passage. Easy passage, if you ask me. So now we will go to the questions. The first question, number 18, says, the passage provides information in support of which of the following assertions? Or which of the following assertions is supported by the passage? Whenever you see such a question, it's always an inference question. The answer won't be outright written in the passage, but it can be inferred from the passage. So we'll go through the options one by one. A says, the disadvantages of an adaptation to a particular feature of an environment often outweigh the advantages of an adaptation. Okay, the disadvantages of an adaptation to a particular feature. The particular feature could be gravity. Okay, so the disadvantages of an adaptation often outweigh the advantages. Absolutely not. The passage does not talk about any disadvantage of those two adaptations. It actually only talks about the advantage. So, and whether they outweigh is absolutely wrong. So A is not happening. But what I did understand is that the language they are using in these options is not very, very direct. I had to read the option twice or thrice to understand what it was saying. Okay, B says, an organism's reaction to being placed in an environment to which it is not well adapted, which is sea snakes now. Sea snakes were placed on land, can sometimes illustrate the problems that have been solved by the adaptations of organisms indigenous to their environment. Okay, it can illustrate the problem that have been solved by the adaptations of organisms indigenous to that environment. You see, when I'm reading options, I'm trying to place different parts of the passage and connect it with the option. So in B, when I said an organism's reaction to being placed in an environment to which it is not well adapted, this is analogous to the sea snake being brought to land. And this was used to illustrate the problem that has been solved exactly by the adaptations in land snakes. And land snakes are indigenous to their environment. So B looks very good to me. And see how I'm doing it. I'm matching the passage with the option, like creating an analogy. So C says, the effectiveness of an organism's adaptation to a particular feature of its environment, the feature can be gravity, can only be evaluated by examining the effectiveness with which organisms of other species have adapted to a similar feature of a different environment. It's totally wrong. See, the one big problem was only be evaluated. Only is a terrible word to ever go with in an inference question. Remember that. Never go with only if you're doing an inference question. Anyway, if I read beyond, um, so it says only be evaluated by examining the effectiveness with which organisms of other species. I don't think we go into other species. We are always talking about snakes, be it terrestrial snakes, be it land snakes, and they have adapted to a similar feature of a different environment. I don't think that's correct either. I mean, that comparison doesn't help us. So C, I think, is totally wrong, and I would have ideally, had I been reading it, I would have left it at only itself. An inference question only is not happening. D says organisms of the same species that inhabit strikingly different environments. This is okay. I'm talking about same species, which is snake, different environments, land and sea, will often adapt in remarkably similar ways. That is wrong. The entire idea is that the adaptations are different in sea snake and land snake. So I don't even need to read beyond this. So D is wrong for that reason. E says different species of organisms living in the same environment will seldom adapt to features of that environment in the same way. Totally wrong. Well, most likely they will adapt in the same way and not seldom adapt. So totally incorrect. B should be the correct answer. It perfectly matches the structure of the passage.